The story begins in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood where life moves at a slow, predictable pace. The houses are neat, the lawns are trimmed, and the streets are so peaceful you can hear birds chirping in the mornings. This is the kind of place where everyone knows each other, at least by face, and neighbors wave as they pass by on their morning walks. It's the perfect suburban dream, or at least it was until recently. Mark, the protagonist's dad, has lived in this neighborhood for over 2 decades. He's a retired man in his late 60s with salt and pepper hair and a warm smile that makes him instantly likable. Mark is the kind of guy who always has a joke ready and never hesitates to help a neighbor fix a fence or carry groceries. He's well respected in the community, not because he tries to be, but because he's genuinely kind and approachable. His house reflects his personality: cozy, welcoming, and just a little quirky. One of the quirks is a cheerful garden gnome standing proudly near the flower beds, a gift from his late wife that holds sentimental value. Lately, though, the neighborhood has started to feel different. A few months ago, the Homeowners Association, HOA, decided to crack down on minor rule violations. At first, it seemed harmless enough. Emails reminding people to keep their trash cans out of sight, or asking them to repaint faded mailboxes. But soon, these reminders turned into strict warnings, and the warnings escalated into personal visits from HOA representatives. Some residents grumbled about the sudden change, while others complied without question, hoping to avoid conflict. Everyone agreed on one thing, though: the HOA had become unusually intense. For Mark, the tightening grip of the HOA felt more amusing than concerning. He'd chuckle whenever he received yet another letter about something trivial, like how his holiday lights were up 2 days too early. To him, it was all part of living in a close-knit community, even if some rules seemed unnecessary. What he didn't realize was that trouble was brewing right around the corner. One afternoon, as Mark sat on his porch sipping lemonade and flipping through an old magazine, he noticed a stranger walking briskly down the street. The man wore a neatly pressed polo shirt with the HOA logo stitched onto the chest, along with khaki pants and polished shoes. In his hand, he carried a clipboard, and his posture screamed authority. Something about him made Mark pause, not quite alarm bells, but maybe a faint curiosity. The man stopped directly in front of Mark's driveway and stared at the garden gnome for a long moment before turning toward the house. Mark set his glass down and leaned back in his chair, watching the scene unfold with mild interest. Little did he know, this encounter would turn into one of the strangest and most unforgettable days of his life. The calm rhythm of his everyday existence was about to be disrupted in ways he couldn't have imagined. The stranger standing at the edge of Mark's driveway finally approached the porch, his steps deliberate and confident. He stopped a few feet away from the steps, clutching his clipboard tightly, as if it were a weapon. With a curt nod, he introduced himself. "Good afternoon, sir. My name is Carl, and I'm with the Homeowners Association enforcement team." His tone was clipped and formal, lacking any warmth or friendliness. Mark raised an eyebrow, but offered a polite smile. "Afternoon, Carl. What brings you here today?" Carl didn't return the smile. Instead, he pointed toward the garden gnome sitting happily amidst the flowers. "That decoration," he said sternly, "is in violation of our community guidelines. Gnomes are explicitly prohibited under Section 3.2 of the HOA rules regarding lawn ornaments." Mark blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the absurdity of the statement. Then he chuckled softly. "You're kidding, right? This old thing. It's been here for years." Carl's expression hardened further. "I assure you, I am not joking. The rules are clear, and all residents must comply. If you refuse to remove it immediately, there will be consequences." At this point, Mark leaned forward slightly in his chair, studying Carl more closely. There was something off about him. His overly stiff demeanor, the way he clutched the clipboard like a lifeline, even the slight tremor in his voice when he spoke. Most HOA representatives, Mark had dealt with before were reasonable people, willing to have a conversation. This man seemed different, almost desperate to assert control. "Well," Mark said slowly, crossing his arms over his chest, "I appreciate your dedication, but I think we can agree that a little gnome isn't exactly causing chaos around here. How about we let it slide?" Carl's jaw tightened. "Sir, I must insist. Failure to comply could result in fines, or worse, legal action." Now Mark frowned. Legal action? Over a garden gnome? It was starting to feel less like an HOA visit and more like some sort of intimidation tactic. Still, he kept his cool. "Look, Carl, I understand you're just doing your job, but I'm not removing the gnome." End of discussion. For a moment, Carl just stood there, glaring at Mark as though trying to intimidate him into submission. But then, without warning, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, a taser. The sunlight glinted off its metallic surface as he held it up, his hand trembling slightly. "Remove the gnome now," he demanded, his voice rising, "or I'll use this." Mark froze, staring at the weapon in disbelief. Had this man really just threatened him with a taser over a harmless decoration? For a split second, anger flared inside him, but he quickly pushed it aside. Instead, he remained calm, his years of experience teaching him that panic wouldn't help the situation. "All right, Carl," Mark said evenly, holding up his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Let's take a step back here. No need for anything drastic." Slowly, he rose from his chair and stepped back toward the door, keeping eye contact with Carl the entire time. Once inside, he locked the door behind him, his mind racing. Who was this guy, and why was he so determined to pick a fight? From the safety of the living room window, Mark watched as Carl paced back and forth on the driveway, muttering to himself and occasionally glancing at the gnome like it had personally insulted him. Whatever Carl's motives were, one thing was clear: this wasn't going to end well unless someone intervened, and Mark knew exactly who to call. Once safely inside the house, Mark wasted no time. He grabbed his phone and dialed his son Alex, who lived just a few blocks away. "Hey, Dad," Alex answered casually, expecting the usual light-hearted conversation they often shared, but Mark's tone was unusually serious. "Alex, I need you to come over right now. Something strange is happening." Intrigued and slightly worried, Alex didn't hesitate. "What's going on? Are you okay?" Mark hesitated for a second, unsure how to explain the situation without sounding like he'd lost his mind. "There's a guy out here claiming to be from the HOA. He's threatening me with a taser because of the garden gnome. I think he might be bluffing, but I don't know. Just get over here." Alex was already grabbing his keys. "A taser? Over a *gnome*? You're kidding, right?" "I wish I were," Mark replied dryly. Within minutes, Alex pulled into the driveway, his car tires crunching against the gravel. Carl was still pacing when Alex stepped out, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. His dad stood near the window, peeking through the blinds, while this so-called HOA enforcer loomed outside like some kind of overzealous security guard. Alex approached cautiously, sizing Carl up. The man looked jittery, almost frantic, his clipboard clutched tightly in one hand while the other hovered near the taser at his side. "Everything all right here?" Alex asked loudly, drawing Carl's attention. Carl spun around, clearly startled by the arrival of another person. "Who are you?" he snapped, trying to regain his composure. "I'm Alex," he replied calmly, stepping closer. "That's my dad you've been harassing. Care to explain what's going on?" Carl straightened his posture, attempting to look authoritative. "Your father is violating HOA guidelines. I've given him multiple warnings, but he refuses to comply. This isn't your business." Alex crossed his arms, unimpressed. "Oh, it absolutely is my business if someone's waving a weapon around and making threats. Let me see your credentials." For the first time, Carl faltered. He glanced down at his clipboard, then back at Alex, his confidence wavering. My credentials aren't relevant here. What matters is that your father needs to remove that gnome immediately. Alex wasn't buying it. Something about Carl felt off. His nervous energy, the way he kept glancing toward the street, as if expecting someone to show up. Listen, Alex said firmly, if you're really with the HOA, there's no reason you shouldn't show us proof. Otherwise, we're calling the cops. At the mention of the police, Carl visibly tensed. His grip tightened on the clipboard, and his eyes darted around nervously. For a moment, it seemed like he might bolt. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and took a step back, putting distance between himself and Alex. But before anyone could make a move, a low rumble filled the air. Two black SUVs turned onto the street, their tires rolling smoothly over the pavement. They slowed to a stop in front of Mark's house, and several men in dark suits stepped out. Each wore badges clipped to their belts, gleaming in the sunlight. One of them carried a folder, while another held a phone pressed to his ear, speaking quietly but urgently. Carl froze, his face draining of color. Whatever bravado he'd mustered earlier vanished completely. He stared at the agents, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Alex and Mark exchanged confused glances before stepping aside to let the newcomers approach. The lead agent stopped directly in front of Carl, his expression unreadable. "Sir, can you tell us what you're doing here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Carl stammered, clutching his clipboard like a lifeline. I'm with the HOA, just enforcing rules." The agent raised an eyebrow. Enforcing rules with a taser? That doesn't sound quite right. He glanced at Mark and Alex, nodding politely. "We'll take it from here." As the agents surrounded Carl, Alex leaned closer to his dad. "What just happened? Who are these guys?" Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Let's just say, things are about to get interesting." The agents quickly took charge of the situation, their presence commanding an immediate sense of authority. Carl, who had been so bold just moments ago, now looked like a cornered animal. His hands trembled as he clutched his clipboard, and his eyes darted between the agents, Mark, Alex, and the two black SUVs parked at the curb. It was clear that whatever confidence he'd mustered earlier had completely evaporated. The lead agent approached Carl with measured steps, his expression calm but unyielding. "Sir," he began, his tone firm yet polite, "can you explain why you're here and what your connection is to this neighborhood?" Carl stammered, clearly struggling to find words. I'm with the HOA. I'm just doing my job. This man," he pointed shakily at Mark, "is violating rules. He won't remove that gnome." The agent glanced toward the garden gnome, raising an eyebrow slightly. Then he turned back to Carl. "And you thought it was appropriate to bring a taser to enforce these rules?" Carl's face flushed red, and he shifted uncomfortably. It's standard procedure for non-compliance cases," he lied, though even he seemed to realize how absurd it sounded. The agent didn't respond immediately. Instead, he exchanged a brief look with one of his colleagues, who nodded almost imperceptibly. The second agent opened the folder he'd been carrying and flipped through a few pages before speaking. "We've been tracking someone fitting your description," he said, his voice low but steady. "He's been impersonating officials in several neighborhoods across the state, targeting homeowners, especially elderly ones, with fraudulent fines and threats." Mark's eyes widened as the pieces began falling into place. "Wait," he interjected, stepping forward. "You mean this guy isn't even part of the HOA?" The lead agent shook his head. "No, sir. Not officially. In fact, we suspect he's part of a larger scheme preying on vulnerable residents. People like you." Alex let out a low whistle, shaking his head in disbelief. Unbelievable. All this over a garden gnome. Carl, meanwhile, was visibly panicking. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead, and his breathing grew rapid and shallow. "Look, I didn't mean any harm," he blurted out, his voice cracking. I was just following orders. Someone hired me to do this, to scare people into paying fake fines or removing stuff from their yards. I didn't know it was illegal. The agents exchanged another glance, this time tinged with frustration. One of them stepped forward and placed a hand firmly on Carl's shoulder. "That's enough," he said sharply. "You're coming with us." As Carl was led toward one of the SUVs, he kept glancing back at Mark, his eyes wide with desperation. "Please," he pleaded weakly, "don't let them take me. I swear I'll leave you alone. Just tell them I'm sorry." Mark crossed his arms, watching silently as Carl was guided into the vehicle. Despite everything, he couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for the man. Clearly, Carl wasn't the mastermind behind the operation. He was just a pawn in a much bigger game. Still, Mark knew better than to interfere. Justice needed to be served, no matter how small the crime might seem. Once Carl was secured in the SUV, the lead agent turned back to Mark and Alex. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said sincerely. "We've been trying to track down individuals involved in this scam for months. Your quick thinking today helped us catch one more piece of the puzzle." Mark nodded, still processing everything that had happened. "Glad we could help," he replied with a faint smile. "Though I have to admit, I wasn't expecting my quiet retirement to involve federal agents showing up at my door." The agent chuckled softly. "Believe me, neither were we. But when someone threatens a decorated former FBI operative with a taser," he trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Alex's jaw dropped. "Wait, what? Dad, you never told me you worked for the FBI." Mark shrugged modestly. "It was a long time ago, and it's not something I talk about much. But apparently, old habits die hard." The agents exchanged knowing smiles before heading back to their vehicles. As the SUVs pulled away, Mark and Alex stood side by side, watching the dust settle. The neighborhood returned to its usual peaceful hum, but both father and son knew things would never quite feel the same again. As the black SUVs disappeared down the street, Mark and Alex stood in stunned silence, trying to process everything that had just unfolded. The quiet afternoon they'd expected had turned into something straight out of a movie script. For Alex, the revelation about his dad's past was almost as shocking as Carl's bizarre behavior. He turned to Mark, his expression a mix of awe and disbelief. "Okay, Dad," Alex said, crossing his arms. "You've got some explaining to do. Since when were you an FBI operative? And why didn't I know about this?" Mark chuckled softly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Like I said earlier, it was a long time ago. Back then, I worked undercover on organized crime cases, mostly dealing with fraud rings and scams like the one Carl's involved in. When I retired, I wanted to leave all that behind. Figured there was no point bringing it up unless it mattered." Alex shook his head, still processing the information. "So what you're saying is, these agents showing up wasn't just random. They knew who you are." Mark nodded slowly. "Yeah, they did. Some of them are old colleagues or people who've worked with me indirectly over the years. Every now and then, they'll swing by to check in or ask for advice on cases similar to ones I handled. Guess today's visit was less about catching up and more about catching crooks." Meanwhile, word of the incident spread quickly through the neighborhood. Neighbors peeked out their windows or stepped onto their porches, curious about the commotion. Mrs. Thompson from across the street approached cautiously, her hands clasped together. "Mark, dear, is everything all right?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "We saw those big cars pull up. Was someone hurt?" Mark smiled reassuringly. "No, no one's hurt, Ellen. Just a little misunderstanding with a man claiming to be from the HOA. Turns out he wasn't legit after all." Mrs. Thompson gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. "Oh my goodness, that explains so much. A few weeks ago, a man came to my door demanding payment for some made-up violation. I thought it seemed odd, but I didn't want any trouble, so I paid him." Alex frowned, stepping closer. "Wait, you actually gave him money? Did you keep a receipt or anything? She nodded hesitantly. I think so. Why? Before Alex could respond, Mark chimed in. Because that receipt might help the FBI track down whoever hired Carl. If enough neighbors report similar incidents, we can put a stop to this whole operation. Word traveled fast in the tight-knit community. Within hours, several residents gathered at Mark's house, eager to share their stories. One couple recounted how they'd been pressured into replacing their mailbox because it supposedly violated HOA guidelines. Another neighbor admitted to paying a fine for leaving a welcome mat outside her door. Each story painted a clearer picture of Carl's scam and the network behind him. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere shifted from shock to relief. People laughed nervously about how ridiculous the situation seemed in hindsight. Can you believe we let someone bully us over mailboxes and mats? Joked Mr. Patel, shaking his head. All this time, I thought I was just being paranoid. By the end of the night, the neighborhood felt united in a way it hadn't before. Residents exchanged phone numbers and promised to stay vigilant. Someone even suggested forming a watch group to report suspicious activity moving forward. Mark listened quietly, feeling proud of his community's resilience. Later, as the crowd dispersed and the house grew quiet again, Alex flopped onto the couch beside his dad. Well, he said with a grin, this has been one heck of a day. I never thought I'd see the FBI show up over a garden gnome. Mark chuckled, leaning back in his chair. Neither did I, son. Neither did I. But hey, at least we got rid of that fake enforcer, and maybe taught everyone a lesson about standing up to bullies, no matter how small the issue seems. Alex raised an eyebrow, glancing toward the gnome still standing proudly in the yard. Think Carl learned his lesson too. Mark smirked. If not, I'm sure the FBI will remind him. The next morning, the neighborhood buzzed with activity as residents eagerly discussed the events of the previous day. News of Carl's arrest and his connection to a larger fraud ring spread like wildfire. People who had once felt powerless against the HOA's increasingly strict enforcement now realized they'd been targeted by criminals posing as officials. The sense of relief was palpable, but it was mixed with anger at how easily they'd been fooled. Mark became an unexpected hero in the community. Neighbors stopped by throughout the day to thank him for standing up to Carl and inadvertently helping expose the scam. Some brought homemade pies or fresh-baked cookies as tokens of gratitude, while others simply wanted to shake his hand. If it weren't for you, Mark, Mrs. Thompson said earnestly, we might never have known what was really going on. Despite the attention, Mark remained humble. I didn't do anything special, he insisted, waving off the praise. Anyone else would have done the same if they saw something fishy. Besides, it was the FBI who caught him, not me. But Alex knew better. He'd seen firsthand how calm and composed his dad had stayed during the confrontation, even when Carl pulled out the taser. Not many people could have handled that situation so smoothly. As he helped unload another plate of cookies from a neighbor, Alex couldn't resist teasing his dad. Face it, Dad, you're kind of a legend around here now. Maybe we should put up a sign. Home of the guy who took down the fake HOA enforcer. Mark rolled his eyes but couldn't suppress a smile. Don't get carried away, Alex. I'm just glad this whole mess is over. Meanwhile, the FBI worked quickly to unravel the rest of the scheme. Agents visited several households to gather evidence, including receipts and photos of the fake enforcers. They discovered that Carl wasn't working alone. He was part of a loosely organized group targeting suburban neighborhoods across multiple states. These scammers preyed on homeowners' fears of fines or legal trouble, often convincing them to pay hefty sums or make unnecessary changes to their properties. As more details emerged, the HOA held an emergency meeting to address the situation. The board members looked visibly embarrassed, apologizing profusely for failing to spot the imposters earlier. We had no idea someone was using our name to commit these crimes, the president admitted. This is unacceptable, and we're taking immediate steps to prevent it from happening again. They announced plans to improve oversight, including issuing official IDs for all representatives and setting up a hotline for residents to verify visits. While some neighbors grumbled about the oversight coming too late, most appreciated the effort. "At least they're trying to fix things now," one resident commented. For Mark, life began returning to normal, or as normal as it could be after such an event. The garden gnome remained firmly in place, now surrounded by a small cluster of flowers planted by grateful neighbors. It had become a symbol of resistance against bullying authority figures, however fake they might be. One evening, as Mark sat on the porch watching the sunset, Alex joined him with 2 glasses of lemonade. "So," Alex said, handing one glass to his dad, "what's next for the retired FBI operative turned neighborhood superhero?" Mark chuckled, sipping his drink. "Oh, I think I'll stick to retirement. No more brushes with criminals for me. At least not until they start arguing over mailbox colors again." They both laughed, enjoying the peaceful moment. For the first time in days, everything felt calm. The neighborhood was safe, the community was stronger than ever, and Mark's garden gnome stood proudly as a reminder that sometimes standing your ground can lead to something extraordinary, even if it starts with something as simple as refusing to move a decoration. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The initial shock of Carl's arrest faded, replaced by a renewed sense of camaraderie among the residents. People who had once only exchanged polite nods now chatted regularly over coffee or while walking their dogs. The shared experience of uncovering the scam had brought them closer together, creating bonds that went beyond surface-level pleasantries. Mark's house became something of a hub for these newfound friendships. Neighbors would stop by unannounced, often bringing snacks or updates about the latest developments in the case. The FBI kept the community informed, sharing tidbits about how Carl and his accomplices had operated. It turned out they'd been running scams in over a dozen neighborhoods, raking in thousands of dollars before getting caught. Hearing the full scope of the operation made everyone grateful that Mark had stood his ground when he did. The garden gnome, once just a quirky decoration, took on a life of its own. Someone jokingly hung a tiny superhero cape around its neck, and soon others followed suit with playful additions: a miniature hat, a pair of sunglasses, even a tiny sign that read "No trespassing." Mark laughed every time he looked at it, shaking his head at how much attention the little statue was getting. "If your mom could see this," he murmured one afternoon, smiling fondly as he adjusted the gnome's sunglasses, "she'd get a kick out of it." Alex teased him relentlessly about his newfound fame. "You know, Dad, if you ever want to write a book about all this, I'm pretty sure it'd be a bestseller. How my garden gnome saved the neighborhood has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" Mark smirked, pretending to consider the idea. "Maybe I'll save it for my memoirs." Chapter 1: The Day I Outsmarted a Fraudster. Despite the humor, there was a deeper lesson in everything that had happened. The incident reminded everyone of the importance of standing up for themselves and each other when something didn't feel right. Mrs. Thompson summed it up perfectly during one of her visits. "Before this, I thought speaking up would make me seem difficult or cause trouble. But now I realize that staying silent only makes things worse. We need to look out for each other." Her words resonated with many, sparking conversations about how to build a stronger, more supportive community. Someone suggested starting a monthly potluck dinner where neighbors could gather to share food and stories. Another proposed organizing weekend cleanup days to spruce up common areas. Even the HOA got involved, hosting workshops to educate residents about spotting scams and protecting themselves from fraud. As autumn approached, the air grew crisp and leaves began to fall, painting the streets in shades of gold and red. Mark spent more time on his porch, watching the world go by. He reflected on how quickly life could change. A quiet afternoon interrupted by chaos, only to end with newfound connections and a renewed appreciation for the people around him. One evening, as he sat sipping tea under the fading light, Alex joined him, holding a letter. "Dad, guess what? The FBI sent you a thank you note." Mark raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "A thank you note? For what? Alex grinned, handing it over. Inside was a brief but heartfelt message thanking Mark for his role in helping dismantle the scam ring. Your quick thinking and calm demeanor were instrumental in resolving this case, it read. We're grateful for citizens like you who help keep our community safe. Mark folded the letter carefully, setting it aside. Well, he said after a moment, that's certainly unexpected. But I suppose it's nice to know they noticed. Alex chuckled, leaning back in his chair. Noticed? Dad, you practically saved the day. Admit it, you enjoyed being the hero, even if it was just for a little while. Mark didn't deny it. Instead, he smiled softly, gazing out at the garden gnome bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. Maybe I did, he admitted. But honestly, Alex, the real heroes are the people who came forward afterward. The ones brave enough to speak up and share their stories. That's what made the difference. And with that, father and son sat in comfortable silence, enjoying the simple beauty of the evening. Life had returned to normal, or perhaps better than normal. The neighborhood wasn't just peaceful, it was united. And through it all, the garden gnome stood proudly, a symbol of resilience, humor, and the power of standing your ground, even against the most unlikely adversaries.